Welcome back. Singapore's inflation picked up in June, and analysts say prices are likely to trend higher through the rest of the year. Core inflation went up from 1.4% in May to 1.6% last month. Headline inflation also rose 1 percentage point to 1.9%. Food inflation rose the most as prices of groceries and food services increased at a faster pace. Larger increases in airfares and holiday expenses also drove up services inflation. Overall, though, the increase in inflation was smaller than expected.
We are still seeing negative contribution in terms of the electricity and gas inflation in year-on-year terms. But going forward, starting from July, we would see a spike in electricity tariffs, and that would be one factor that would push inflation higher.
Renewed tensions in the Middle East could also drive another round of higher global energy prices. Meanwhile, changing climate conditions like El Niño could threaten global crop yields and put food prices under pressure. For this year, core and headline inflation are projected to average 1.5 to 2.5%, but economists say the outlook remains uncertain.
If there's going to be less than severe El Niño conditions, then perhaps the initial fears of higher food prices will dissipate. And this also means that inflation pressures, given that food and oil or energy remains to be a very strong and carries significant weightage, in the Singapore's inflation weightage basket, does suggest that these two commodities will actually make or break how inflation pressures will move in the second half of the year.
For consumers, though, inflation isn't always about paying more. It can come in a more subtle form known as shrinkflation. That's when shoppers pay the same or more for less or lower quality products. But just how common is it? To find out, the Singapore Department of Statistics carried out an ad hoc study on shrinkflation. Using barcode data from major supermarkets, it analysed around 3,000 products commonly bought by households. The result, less than 5% of items were hit by shrinkflation in 2025. Instant coffee and tea were the hardest hit by shrinkflation. Next were laundry detergent, ice cream, milk powder, and diapers. After factoring in changes in size, SingStat found that shoppers were effectively paying between 5 and 16% more for these products. So, how can you tell if you're getting your money's worth? Well, unit pricing is one way to compare products of different sizes. It was piloted at major supermarket chains last year and is now set to expand to more products and outlets. But as Nasha Rahim reports, not every store is able to bear the added cost.
Last September, major supermarkets rolled out unit pricing for certain categories like vegetables. Customers can see the cost of the product per unit of measure, for example, per kilogram or per litre. It's easier to compare value across different product sizes and brands. The pilot will be expanded to cover more in-store and online outlets and a wider range of grocery items later this year. Daily staples and essentials like sauces, bread, flour and diapers are what Fair Price plans to include. The Competition and Consumer Commission of Singapore, which co-led the pilot, says it seeks to balance between consumers' needs and requirements that are practical for participating retailers. While the program is not mandatory, some minimarts say implementation may mean that they have to manually calculate the prices, which this adds to their overheads.
So our store mostly sells snacks, drinks and canned food. So there's not much unit pricing available for us to do as of now. But in the future, if it does get implemented on these category of products, we know that there are challenges like manpower cost, meaning I have to implement extra manpower in my warehouse to print the stickers, which is an extra additional cost, and also then additional cost of training my outlet staff to paste it next to our current existing store prices.
Instead, this retailer says promotions and bundle deals are a more effective way for their shoppers to save. An analyst says unit pricing also has its limits, especially when it comes to products where brand matters more.
But unit pricing may be less valuable when you're talking about, comparing packages where there's a lot of things you consider besides just how much weight are you getting for your money. So, for example, even if you look at something simple like instant noodles, right? You could, of course, do unit pricing, compare the amount of weight of noodles you're buying, but of course, consumers will say, but is that really relevant? Because, brand A has this flavor or taste, so I prefer it to brand B. So, for products where there might be a lot more concerns about, things like flavor.
Authorities say they will continue to monitor the implementation of the expanded pilot before determining the next steps.
And for more analysis, we're joined by Denise Cheok, who is head of Southeast Asia Economics from Moody's Analytics. Denise, welcome to the show. Now, as we can see, the food, services, and retail goods, all of it ticked up in June. So which of these are you most concerned about over the next 6 to 12 months, say, and why?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think for us, the concern really is on food inflation, which is more of a supply shock, right? So we know that fertilizer feedstock was affected by the conflict in the Middle East. This is linked to gas supply. And also we have El Nino around the corner, right? So we're very concerned over the harvest of crops like grain, rice, and wheat, especially in the next couple of months. For services and retail inflation, this is more linked to demand side. So this is the sort of good kind of inflation, right? It's more linked to economic growth. It means that the economy is booming, and so that's the kind of inflation that we really want to see.
Do you think the rising inflation could increase people's perception that prices are rising faster than the official data is suggesting? And can that perception then eventually influence actual inflation?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it depends on what you buy, right? Your consumption basket. For Singapore, if we look at the weightage, we know that for the average Singaporean, you mostly spend on food, utilities and housing, as well as transport. So whether in terms of petrol or bus or train, that kind of thing. So how much you feel the inflation really depends on how much you spend on, right? If food prices are being hit and a lot of your budget's really being spent on food, then that's where you will feel the hit.
And with the geopolitical uncertainties in recent years especially, will it be harder to predict inflation levels going forward?
Yeah, so I think forecasting has been very difficult, right? Since COVID, since 2020, there are just a lot of competing forces and events happening. We had COVID, we had supply chain disruptions, we have so many wars. The current oil shock that we are experiencing right now is the second in just 4 years, right? When previously, before these, oil shocks weren't actually very common. So, as you like to say, the confidence bands are very wide just because we're not following the standard business cycle anymore. And so, yeah, I think it'll be inflation going forward is going to be quite volatile.
And as inflation becomes more unpredictable, what does that all mean for everyday households? For example, does budgeting then become a lot harder if prices move in sudden bursts instead of following a very steady, predictable trend?
Yeah, it is quite difficult, right, for the average household. And I think a lot of it depends on what is being hit, whether it's the kind of food that you're buying or the exact kind of petrol that you're using. For Singapore, we know that we import a lot of our food and a lot of our energy, right? So there's a lot of diversity there. I think the good thing is that, there's that availability to switch to something more affordable if needed. So maybe if the type of rice they usually consume is being hit by all these supply chain disruptions, there's option to switch to maybe rice produced from other areas. So that could be sort of the way to manage these unpredictability in inflation going forward.
Yeah, and meanwhile, MAS's monetary policy statement, that's set to be released by the end of the month. What's your take on what we can expect?
Yes, so MAS will be meeting next week. Actually, it's quite a hard call for this month, right? They already tightened in April in their last meeting. And since then, I think headline core inflation is very well within that 1.5 to 2.5 range that they expected to be. The Singapore dollar has also been quite strong since then. So I think our stance is really for MAS to hold steady for this round, to wait for the impact of the April tightening to flow through the economy. I think the good thing about this new quarterly schedule that they're on is that they can reassess again in 3 months. They don't really need to wait for 6 months to wait for another call. But I think the question really is whether MAS wants to preempt any further imported inflation, especially on food prices, which we were just talking about, because that is really linked to the situation surrounding the Strait of Hormuz as well. So, I think for us, our stance is for MAS to hold steady, but it's not surprising if they take the preemptive move to tighten once again.
And with the risks to the inflation outlook also tilted to the upside, do you expect the government to announce additional cost of living support during the National Day rally that's going to happen next month?
Yeah, so I think for cost of living measures, things like CDC vouchers, right? We really see this announced during budget in February rather than NDR. It's not unprecedented because we have had some announcements during past NDRs that address cost of living support, but these are more long-term measures, right? Things like skills future credits or changes, in the CPF structure. So I don't expect to hear any big announcements, but it's not surprising, I think, if we do hear some periphery measures linked to cost of living.
Denise, thank you so much for your insights. That was Denise Cheok, who is head of Southeast Asia Economics from Moody's Analytics.